They've always been this way. 50 years ago, Iran and Israel were not enemies. They were, by almost any practical definition of the word, allies. That calculation changed. It can change again. If you've watched the news in the past year or two, you've seen this. Iran and Israel, locked in what looks like an ancient, inevitable, civilizational conflict. Two countries that seem to exist purely to destroy each other. And if you asked most people, including most journalists, why they hate each other, you'd get some version of the same answer. Religion. History. They've always been this way. Except they haven't. 50 years ago, Iran and Israel were not enemies. They were, by almost any practical definition of the word, allies. And understanding how that changed, and why it changed, and who it serves, tells you something uncomfortable about how ancient hatreds actually work. Let's go back to the 1950s and build this from scratch. Israel was founded in 1948. From day one, it was surrounded by Arab states that wanted it gone: Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq. This wasn't a cold diplomatic tension. These countries fought actual wars trying to eliminate Israel in 1948, 1967, and 1973. So Israel, from the very beginning, had a strategic problem. It needed friends in a neighbourhood that was almost entirely hostile. Iran, at this point, was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarchy backed by the United States and the UK after a 1953 coup removed a democratically elected prime minister. The Shah was secular, pro-Western, and deeply suspicious of Arab nationalism. Iran and Israel looked at each other and saw the same thing. We're both non-Arab states in an Arab-dominated region. We have the same enemies. This became the basis of what Israel called the periphery doctrine, building alliances with non-Arab states on the edges of the Arab world. Iran was the most important of these. What did this alliance actually look like? Iran sold oil to Israel, not symbolically, massively. At one point, up to 75% of Israel's oil came from Iran. There was a pipeline. Israel helped build it. Israel and Iran shared intelligence. Israel helped train SAVAK, the Shah's feared secret police. Israeli military advisors operated in Iran. There were direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Iranian Jews, one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, travelled freely. Trade, tourism, quiet but real diplomatic contact. This wasn't a reluctant arm's-length arrangement. It was a functioning strategic partnership that lasted over 2 decades. 31 years. Now here's what the story usually skips over. Why did the revolution happen at all? Because if everything was going so well, oil money, modernization, a functioning alliance with Israel, why did millions of Iranians take to the streets to tear the whole thing down? The answer is that for most Iranians, it wasn't going well at all. The Shah's Iran was, on paper, modernizing fast. But that modernization was brutally uneven. Oil wealth flowed to the elite and to Western-connected business interests. Rural Iranians and the urban poor saw almost none of it. The gap between the westernized upper class in North Tehran and the rest of the country was enormous and getting wider. And if you complained about any of this publicly, you met SAVAK. SAVAK was the Shah's secret police, built with help from the CIA and trained in part by Israeli advisors. It became one of the most feared intelligence organizations in the region. Torture was systematic. Disappearances were routine. Amnesty International estimated tens of thousands of political prisoners. So when Iranians chanted against the Shah, they weren't just chanting against one man. They were chanting against a system, backed by America, enabled by Western allies including Israel, that had been oppressing them for 25 years. And the history they were drawing on was vivid. In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He nationalized Iranian oil, the idea that Iranian oil should belong to Iranians. The British and Americans organized a coup. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah was reinstated. Iranian democracy, such as it was, ended. Iranians didn't forget this. It was 26 years ago when the revolution happened, but it felt like yesterday. So when Khomeini offered a framework that rejected the Shah, rejected America, and rejected everything America had touched, including Israel, it landed on ground that had been prepared by decades of genuine grievance. The revolution wasn't manufactured. The anger was real. The cause was legitimate. What was manufactured, with extraordinary speed, was who to aim that anger at. Khomeini had a comprehensive ideological vision. A key part was the absolute rejection of Israel, which he called a Zionist entity illegitimately occupying Muslim land, and the rejection of America, the Great Satan that had enabled the Shah. The revolution completed in February 1979. By spring, the Israeli diplomatic mission in Tehran had been handed over to the PLO. Within months, death to Israel had gone from a fringe slogan to a state-sponsored chant. In less than a year, a country went from selling Israel most of its oil to calling for its destruction. The same geography, the same people, but an entirely new national enemy, conjured almost overnight. The grievance was real, the enemy was chosen. Here's the part that gets uncomfortable. The animosity between Iran and Israel since 1979 is real. The proxy wars are real. Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Yemen. The nuclear anxiety is real. People have died, a lot of them. But underneath the genuine hostility, there's a question worth asking. Who benefits from this conflict being permanent? For the Iranian government, Israel as an existential enemy is extraordinarily useful. It unites a population that has many reasons to be angry at its own government. It justifies military spending, authoritarian controls, the suppression of dissent. Death to Israel is not just foreign policy, it's domestic politics. For the Israeli government, Iran as an existential threat justifies its own military spending, its own emergency powers, its own suppression of conversations about Palestinian rights. An available enemy is a governance tool. Neither of these governments wants to solve the problem. A solved conflict is a useless conflict. And then there's the arms industry, American, Russian, European, that has made hundreds of billions of dollars equipping both sides and their proxies over the past 4 decades. None of this is a conspiracy. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to be in everyone's interest to keep the fire burning. There's something else worth naming here. Throughout all of this, the alliance, the revolution, the enmity, the proxy wars, the people of Iran and Israel have mostly had nothing to do with any of it. Iranian Jews, one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, still live in Iran today. Somewhere between 8,000 and 25,000 of them, practicing their religion, going about their lives, in the country that officially calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. That's not a footnote. That's a contradiction that the official narrative can't absorb. Polls of ordinary Iranians consistently show far less hostility toward Israelis as people than the government's rhetoric suggests. The same is likely true in the other direction. The conflict between Iran and Israel is, in a very real sense, a conflict between governments and ideologies, not between the people who happen to live in those places. The people who hate each other are the ones who've never met. So where does this leave us? I'm not going to tell you there's an easy path to peace between Iran and Israel. There isn't. 45 years of proxy wars, nuclear anxiety, assassinations, and ideological entrenchment don't dissolve overnight. But the history we've just walked through suggests something important about what would actually need to change. The conflict was built on a specific structure: two governments that found each other more useful as enemies than as anything else, sustained by external interests, sold to their populations as ancient, sacred, non-negotiable. Which means the path towards something different requires governments, on both sides, to stop needing the other as a villain. That's hard. It requires changes inside Iran that Iranians themselves have been pushing for, at enormous personal cost, for decades. It requires changes inside Israel about what security actually means. And it requires the rest of us to stop accepting the framing that this is inevitable. History is not destiny. The alliance of 1967 was not destiny. The enmity of 1979 was not destiny. Both were choices made by specific people under specific circumstances for specific reasons. The Iranian Jews who still live in Tehran know something the headline writers don't: that it is possible to exist, quietly and stubbornly, in the space between official narratives. That governments declare enemies, but people still buy groceries and raise children and find ways to live alongside each other. That's not a solution. But it might be where solutions start. In the refusal to believe that the story you've been told is the only story there is. Iran and Israel were allies once. Not because they were the same, not because there were no tensions, but because the people making decisions found it more useful to cooperate than to destroy each other. That calculation changed. It can change again. I don't know what the Middle East looks like in 10 years. Nobody does. But I'm suspicious of any story that tells you the hatred is ancient, the conflict is inevitable, and the only question is how much damage gets done along the way. History didn't start with the last missile strike, and it doesn't have to end there either. More questions next time.